you serious? Al, over here! Oh.
I want to see everything. Washington, D.C., Las Vegas. And what's the name of that place that sells peanut butter and brings it to you on a forklift?
Costco.
The whole time I served in Afghanistan, Al was my interpreter.
Hey, welcome! Let me get you a beer.
Dad, no alcohol.
Right, oh, sorry.
No, your son should be sorry for talking to you with that tone of voice.
I like him.
Despite the UK being a sort of hellhole for politics, just like the United States, one thing I'm grateful that we didn't import from there is how many awful sitcoms you guys have, because I don't think I was aware until I researched this video just how many that I've never heard of come out every single year or have pilots. Now, one I have watched when I was younger, because it's very famous, it has Charlie Sheen in it, was 2.5 Men. Of course, Charlie Sheen was eventually replaced by Ashton Kutcher, but I watched this maybe when I was a teenager, like 14, 15, and I found it quite funny. I could also imagine it not aging very well. But for today's video, we're going to talk about Chuck Lorre's new project, the United States of Al. Chuck Lorre is going to bless us by showing us the potential wacky hijinks that will ensue when a US veteran of the war in Afghanistan lets his Afghani interpreter come to stay with his family. Now, we're going to get into the trailer in a bit. It is so embarrassing, so not funny. I thought it was like a parody trailer for something like SNL or The Office. That's how bad it is. And then we're going to talk about the reaction online. We're going to talk about who's involved with this, because Reza Aslan is also involved in this. There are Afghans working on this, but we're going to get into that as well. And then we're going to talk about why this is so problematic, because the West, including the US and the UK, has left loads of the Afghan interpreters who worked with them behind in Afghanistan. And if the new Afghanistan that seems to be coming includes the Taliban, or if the Taliban just take over again, who do you think they're going to go after first? Now, before we go any further, recently YouTube demonetized my entire channel, supposedly for bullying. What had actually happened is I'd been mass flagged by some community or some fans. Thankfully, after bigger creators like the Humanist Report, the Surfs, Carl Kalinsky, and Wowshi retweeted the tweet, YouTube went back on its policies, but it showed me how fragile this is as a source of income. So if you want to support my work continuing for the future, regardless of what YouTube do, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the Kavernacle on Instagram and Twitter. Now we're slowly chugging along to 30k. For every 5k we get a new chocolate orange. You know you want to see this tower. And you know one day when I hit 100k, you want to see me live streaming, eating all this stale chocolate orange, because I'm sure they'll be stale by the time I get to 100k. All of that out the way, we're now gonna get into the trailer. Now, I'm just gonna give a small warning. I don't know how zealous the people who make this stuff are gonna be with like copyright and everything like that. So hopefully you're just going to watch the trailer as it is and as you can find it on social media. If not, you're gonna just hear the audio and me placing screen grabs all over it. I'll also maybe try and mess with like the color saturation to try and trick them. And finally, if all of that doesn't work, I'm probably just gonna describe it or something, or maybe not even upload the video, but let's just hope it works.
Are you serious? Al, over here! Oh.
I want to see everything. Washington, D.C., Las Vegas. And what's the name of that place that sells peanut butter and brings it to you on a forklift?
Costco.
The whole time I served in Afghanistan, Al was my interpreter.
Hey, welcome! Let me get you a beer.
Dad, no alcohol.
Right, oh, sorry.
No, your son should be sorry for talking to you with that tone of voice.
I like him.
Daddy! Do you know that your Uncle Al is your godfather?
Which some might say is even more important than an actual father.
No one says that.
How could you not tell me you were having marriage problems? I could have fixed it.
From Afghanistan?
It's not the moon. We have Wi-Fi.
I appreciate how much you want to help, but we couldn't make it work.
Do you think you tried hard enough?
He's the one who didn't try hard enough.
He was probably exhausted from war. There was a lot of walking.
Thank you for keeping my brother safe.
As your godfather, I will protect you for the rest of my life.
Will you be my godfather too?
Get your own.
Thank you for welcoming me into your home.
What's happening?
You'll get used to it.
So, really, really cringy, not funny, can't believe it's even real. Now, is there a silver lining to this? Maybe if this show is popular, a lot of Americans might see Afghans as, you know, real people, like this guy says. Afghanistan has Wi-Fi, it's not the moon. I think that's the only line I liked in terms of like, yeah, Afghans and Afghani people are real people just like you and me, just because all you see of them on the news is like the Taliban and stuff. Alright, so let's get into some of the reactions. So Reineccius says, in America, we destroy your country and then make a poorly done sitcom featuring your people as a token punchline that love America. Girl Boss Hate Account says, the entire premise of the show is white people and their token Muslim friend. What stage of war and terror is this? Nakacha Karam says, please stop doing this to brown people on TV. Lady Whistle Diep says, white people love invading other countries, kill a shit ton of civilians, and then make movie TV shows about how they feel super bad about it, and they were nice to one brown person one time. Also see every Vietnam film ever made. I spoke about that a lot as well. Rami Ishmael says, Arabs, Middle Eastern folks can't even get a version of Ted Lasso without the origin story being, the US military saved you from your own lands by bombing you all to shit again, sheesh, be grateful, which is also bullshit because in reality, the US left most interpreters to die, so we're going to get back to that point. So like I said, Reza Aslan is working on the show as an executive producer, and he says, maybe learn a little about the show, its creators, its producers, its 4 Afghan writers, its plot, and pretty much everything else before you announce your opinions of it, just the thought. Now, I don't think he's lying, but I went through the writing team and I could only find one notable person from Afghanistan who's working on the show. And I think this is a very nice wrinkle to it, because this guy is super interesting. He actually grew up in Afghanistan, but he's also a journalist. So his name is Habib Sahuri. And an article I read about him, so Habib Sahuri was scared to seek asylum in the US, so he pushed a rickety bicycle through snow to get to Canada. So Habib Sahuri was deep in the forest, his face and fingers going numb. He was lost, freezing and growing desperate by the hour. Like hundreds of refugees, Sahuri was risking his life to sneak into Canada, but Sahuri was not fleeing from some war-torn country. He was running away from the US. Sahuri worked as a journalist back in Kabul, Afghanistan, and his reporting on the war made him a target. In 2014, he came to the US for graduate school, and as he was preparing to go back home at the end of December 2015, he received a phone call from his mum. She said he was getting death threats and his life would be in danger if he returned. At the time, the US was heading into the presidential election year with Donald Trump as the leading Republican candidate. Sahuri says a surge in anti-Muslim rhetoric in the US scared him. He was worried about what would happen if he tried to stay in the US, so he decided to flee to Canada. So that is the most prominent Afghan working on this show. Someone who actually fled America because he feared for his life because of the anti-Muslim rhetoric of the Republican Party and Donald Trump. Now, what does Habib Sahuri actually think about the US invasion, and what does his family think as a guy who came from Afghanistan? And now, just before we get into that, find it very ironic. The guy who's helped writing your show about an Afghan interpreter's experience of America is an Afghan who fled America because he was scared for his life as a Muslim person. It just blows my mind that Reza Aslan is like, oh, maybe think about, who's writing the show, when the most prominent Afghan person actually had to flee the country the show is set in because he was an Afghan Muslim. So he wrote an article saying Americans invaded Afghanistan in the middle of a civil war, essentially picking one side, the warlords, against the other side, the Taliban, since it was the Taliban that had refused to hand over bin Laden following 9/11, but the warlords were the very people who had killed thousands of innocents and destroyed the country during the Civil War. The United States had helped arm them to drive out the Soviets in the 1980s. It was that fighting in turn which paved the way for the Taliban in the 1990s. In driving out the Taliban, the Americans sided with one group of human rights violators against another. So he goes on to say, after 15 years of constant war, though it is still hard to evaluate the impact of the US invasion, the answer depends on who you ask. For Afghans who live in cities, there is hardly any war except occasional suicide bombings. Roads are paved, schools are opened, and households have electricity. These conditions lend themselves to a rather positive view of the invasion. On the other hand, for Afghans who live in the countryside, where not only the bulk of the fighting and dying has taken place, but little else has changed, save for some new government buildings, people I've met and spoken to tend to have a negative view. Back when we were rooting for the US invasion of Afghanistan, I remember my father saying it would end all wars in our country. At that moment, my father's words sounded like music to me, but going back, I realised that my father was having one of his Wilsonian moments. Not only did the US invasion not end all the wars in Afghanistan, it created more of them. So again, very interesting. This is the most prominent Afghanistan writer on the show, but from what I can see, he's maybe just part of the writer's room or some, I guess, less involved role, because when you actually look at the writers and director of the pilot, they're all Americans. Now, it's good they had this guy in on it because it's clear, you know, he understands Afghanistan, he lived there, he was a journalist in Afghanistan, so I respect him for that. But also what the problem is, a lot of the other people on this show don't have an experience of Afghanistan like this guy, and it's not like this guy created the show. And I spoke so much about Orientalism and Edward Said on this channel, you know, basic bitch of political science that I am. Power and knowledge is what I want to focus on, in the sense that, like, when you have the power, like a sitcom, even though it's silly, but in this context, for a lot of people who watch this crap sitcom, it might be some of their only exposure of, you know, someone from Afghanistan being normal and like an actual human being, because they're never represented like this usually. So then I do find it a bit problematic that the lead actor was born in South Africa to an Indian family. Now I was trying to find his religion to see if he was Muslim, because maybe, you know, make it slightly better, but he was married in a Hindu temple. That's all I could find. So I assume he actually is probably Hindu Indian. So again, you're going to make a whole show about an Afghan interpreter who comes to the US and all, you know, the wacky hijinks that happen with this cultural clash, while the actor playing him is a Hindu from South Africa of an Indian background. Most parts of India aren't exactly that similar to Afghanistan. This guy has played Pakistani Muslims in the past, and I guess, you know, Pakistan has a lot more similarities with Afghanistan and the tribal makeup of both those countries. But again, I don't think it's a great point if you're going to be like, give this show a chance, we have nuance, we have Afghan people in the writer's room, and then, but the person we're going to cast as the Afghan interpreter, he was born in South Africa with an Indian background. Again, not the best look. So that is more like the cultural stuff out the way, but now let's talk about how much in poor taste it is to make a show about, you know, look, this Afghan interpreter got to come to the US, where most of them have just been left behind and the government don't want to accept them anymore. The UK have done the exact same thing with interpreters in Afghanistan and Iraq. These people who risk their lives to help the US because they want a better life, some of them join when they're kids, and I'm going to read you some examples of these interpreters who either got killed or left behind. And then to make a show that really makes light of the serious issue, like, who the hell came up with this idea? It is just so ridiculous, and it's just so tone deaf and insensitive. But now let's get into the real issue, in case you're unaware, of how the US treats these interpreters. So there's a good article I read in Smithsonian, The Tragic Fate of the Afghan Interpreters the US Left Behind, and this was in 2016. So it goes on to say, Sakidad Afghan was 19 when he started working as an interpreter for the US military in 2009. His father was sick and he wanted to help support their extended family of 18. In his first year, he saw combat with the Marines in the Battle of Marja, but he remained an interpreter until the fall of 2014, when American troops drew down and his job disappeared. By then, he'd received an anonymous death threat over the phone, so he'd applied for a special visa to live in the US. He'd been in the application pipeline for 3 years when in March 2015, he went to see about a new interpreting job in Helmand. Days later, one of his brothers got a phone call from a cousin asking him to come over and look at a picture that had been posted on Facebook. The picture was of Sakidad. He had been tortured and killed and left by the side of the road. He was 24. A letter bearing the Taliban flag was found stuffed in his pants pocket. It warned that 3 of his brothers, who also worked for the coalition, were in for the same treatment. And that is the fate of many people who helped the coalition forces, not just interpreters. You saw earlier with journalists as well, they get threatened. Lots of people who helped them, and it's the dilemma the US are facing at the moment, that if they totally withdraw from Afghanistan, what happens to all these people if you don't help them flee? And people are saying it's going to be like Saigon in 1975. Well, it's going to be worse than Saigon, because there was lots of fear-mongering about what the North Vietnamese and the NLF would do. And while they did carry out, a fair few killings, they did put loads of people in re-education camps instead. The Taliban aren't putting anyone in re-education camps, they're just straight up going to kill them all. So the article goes on to say, Sakidad Afghan's death reflects an overlooked legacy of America's longest and ongoing war, the threat to Afghans who served with the US mission there. In 2014, the International Refugee Assistance Project, a non-profit based in New York, estimated that an Afghan interpreter was being killed every 36 hours. The visa that Sakidad was waiting for was intended as a lifeline for interpreters who are threatened. Congress approved a special immigrant visa program in 2009, and some 9,200 Afghans have received this visa, along with 17,000 of their dependents. But the number of visas has lagged behind the demand, as has the pace at which the State Department awarded them. By law, an application is supposed to be processed within 9 months. It often takes years, and now, unless Congress extends the program, it will close to applicants at the end of this year. An estimated 10,000 interpreters may be left vulnerable. But back in 2016, Congress was unwilling to renew or expand the Afghan program for a variety of reasons. Lawmakers have taken issue with the potential cost. They have questioned why so many visas had yet to be issued. Some have registered concern over the number of immigrants coming into the US, arguing that they were terrorists posing as interpreters and they could slip into the country quite easily. But former soldiers who depended on the interpreters say that the military already screened these men and they passed the most basic test. They were entrusted with the lives of US troops and at times risked their own. Moreover, the visa vetting process is rigorous, entailing no fewer than 14 steps. Documentation of service is required, so is a counterintelligence exam, which may include a polygraph, and so is proof that an applicant has come under threat. Supporters of the visa program argue that some of the requirements are virtually impossible for some interpreters to meet. They've been unable to gather references from long-departed supervisors or from defunct contractors. They've flunked the visa polygraph exam despite passing previous polygraphs, a problem that advocates blame on the exam, which isn't always reliable. The fate of Afghan interpreters left behind troubles Erin Treeb, an American photojournalist who covered American infantry units in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011. On a trip to Kabul last year, Treeb met a man named Mashal, who had been an interpreter for 9 years and was now waiting to see if he'd be approved for a visa. He said he wouldn't live with his family, his wife and his 3 daughters for his own safety. He pulled his daughters out of school for the same reason. And then he goes on to say that the service of a lot of these interpreters in the US military is a massive secret. They can't tell their friends, they can't tell their relatives, and they don't talk to one another. So you hear that and it's really, really tragic. Essentially the US were like, help us build your country and we'll keep you safe. And when the US started thinking, maybe we're not going to stick around forever, but if you helped us, you can come live in the US. We will thank you for your service because we know if you stay in Afghanistan, there is a massive threat to your life, shown by what the Taliban have already done. And that's only going to get worse as, peace talks go forward and the Taliban either gain a bigger foothold politically, or if that all goes bad, militarily when they actually take over again. And it will be worse than Saigon in 1975, I'm sure, because the Taliban are far more ruthless than the North Vietnamese were. But it just shows how much in poor taste this show is. This character of Al would have had to gone through a rigorous screening process, which he could have failed. He would have been very lucky to get to move to the US with his, bestie, who was in the US military and was a veteran of Afghanistan as well. And then it's also extremely problematic to show him as this wacky character. Kind of feels like, he's the butt of the jokes. Him not understanding America is very, very funny. He's like this incredibly alien guy who doesn't know how to handle social interactions. And if any of you would have met people from Afghanistan, I know I've met people from Afghanistan at university, they don't have problems with adjusting to Western life. If you speak to them, it's not like they don't understand social norms and stuff. So it's more like ridiculous Orientalism kind of stuff where it's like, this Afghan, while he may, help people see that Afghans and Muslims are just like you and me, if you're like a bigoted American who doesn't understand that already, the problem is it's not representative of what, an Afghan person would be like, especially one who can speak English and has had experience of Westerners, because this character is an interpreter, so he would have been around US service people a lot. he wouldn't then come to the US and he'd be all like wacky and wouldn't fit in like at all. And then there's the problem of the actor playing him actually being, you know, Indian heritage and born in South Africa, so essentially nothing to do with Afghanistan, and then he's actually seems to not even be a Muslim either. He was married in a Hindu temple. And I don't know if he is a Muslim or not, but I think the main problem is that he's from India and not Afghanistan, so it's really not comparable. And they should have cast someone from Afghanistan, and they should have had people on the main writing credits be from Afghanistan instead of just being in the writer's room, because then you get stupid depictions of stuff like this. So overall, I just think the whole thing is really in poor taste, glosses over some real serious issues of both the war in Afghanistan and how abandoned many of these interpreters were, and to top that all off, it just looks so bad. So anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the description. Let me know if you like any Chuck Lorre stuff like 2.5 Men or whatever. Tell me if 2.5 Men is aged badly. I want to know that because I haven't watched it in like 10 years. If you want to find me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, come join our communities on my subreddit and my Discord. If you want to support my work, please check out my Patreon. And if you have made it this far, thank you for watching.